Tom King, Jason Fabok, Brad Anderson and Derron Bennett do a lovely job in Batman 21. Regardless of thoughts or feelings about linking Watchmen into the DC universe or anything else, from a pure point of structure, it's a very interestingly told story. I've talked about King's use of the 9-panel grid on this show before, and I've discussed his work a couple of times further on the Patreon, and this episode is actually an extension of something I'd previously done as an article, but I want to talk a little bit more about it. Firstly, it's worth noting that the whole issue here deals almost exclusively with time as a concept. The theme running through nearly every single page is time passing, or waiting for time to pass. Take the early example of the 2 pages that sit side by side with the 9-panel grid, and Batman rolling the badge over his fingers. Time is specifically slowed down as we watch the badge roll over each finger, bounce across the knuckle, then roll back onto the next finger. It takes 2 full pages, and that's 17 panels, to get the badge across the knuckles on one hand and back into the palm. And that's a hell of a long time visually, even in the comic, especially in a superhero book. Alongside that, we've got a fight that's taking place between 2 hockey players. What we're being given here is a waiting game. Early in the issue, we've established these hockey players are going to kill each other, as told by another character, and so we're watching something play out that we already know will happen, and we're watching it very, very slowly. Fabok patiently zooms in on the hockey players, going from a wide shot to being right up in the action, though interestingly still keeping the distance by leaving the frame of the monitor we're watching it on in shot, rather than placing in the location with the fight. The colour treatment over it also highlights this distancing. It's got a colour hold across it, so the blacks are washed out in contrast to the dark ink on Batman himself. And I really don't think that's accidental, or at least it's not accidental that we keep it all in the Batcave and don't cut to live in the arena. It seems to make it mean less, or it feels less real, and the constant cross-cutting to the rolling badge gives us a sense that while this is important, it's too far away to create a real sense of fear. The casual action of Batman directly contrasts with the brutality to create that effect. It's also highly reminiscent of the Alan Moore style in Watchmen, with the captions working to distance the effect of the comedian being killed while detectives speak in the current time. It would give a different effect if they didn't play it out in that many panels. If you did this, for example, in 3 panels each, you'd lose the sense of time passing, as the focus would end up changing. And that's one of the toughest things in comics, because sometimes to create the real effect of actually feeling time, you need to keep an action going for a really, really long time. Like I talked about in the Time Signatures episode of Strip Panel Naked before, time works quite differently in comics. And so to really feel the time passing, you end up needing to show a series of repeated panels. A classic example would be, say, cutting to a clock, cutting to an action, cutting back to the clock, but the time is a little bit later, and now the character is just finishing up their action. That does show that time has passed, of course, but do we really feel the time passing as an audience, or are we just aware that for that character in the story, that time has passed? But it also comes back to the regulated grid format. By keeping everything the same size within the same sized panels, nothing starts to mean more, or take on more emphasis. The time for each panel is more evenly regulated, and it does start to feel like a ticking clock through the page, keeping pace. Which is a big benefit of using a structured grid when laying out your story, because it gives the pages a natural rhythm. Here, the 3 wide, 3 tall of the 9-panel grid creates a continuous beat pattern throughout the pages, and it's broken only once when it gets going for this big action moment in the middle of the book. Which does link nicely in the other example I want to talk about from this, which is pages later in the story that literally have a countdown timer on them. That's King and Fabok building an inevitability into the story. We know the outcome, we know that Flash will be turning up when this countdown gets to the end, and we now know exactly when it will happen. It's incredibly regulated, each panel giving the passing time of 1 second as denoted by Bennett's captions. Each of these panels doesn't necessarily take a second to read. Some have speech balloons that will slow down that pace, and it's ultimately very dependent on the reader obviously and how they consume the story individually, but they're assigning a specific time allowance to the story of each image. These each take 1 second. It's essentially applying a visual identifier to that structured pace I mentioned earlier with the 9-panel grid. Rather than relying just on the pattern of that, by placing those time captions in there, they're actively engaging with the audience to explain how this time is working within the story. Again, it's a clever effect that gives the story a pulse, pushing forward with a very specific rhythm, and it imbues each subsequent panel with a little more urgency than the previous one. Each new panel now, by the nature of the design, is driving us a little closer to that inevitable climax. Fabok and King pull that off without needing to change panel sizes or shapes or do anything particularly dramatic with the layout. It's all done through a small caption in the bottom right and the regulated time structure. What it also does though is create a distance to what we're seeing on the page in each panel, because it undercuts the reading of the book. Rather than sucking you in and engaging you purely with the story inside the panels, it's playing a separate story over the top, in which we're becoming more and more aware of the fact the Flash will be turning up when this timer hits 0. It's creating a bit of distance in the narrative, in a similar way to the Hellboy in Hell episode, and in fact close to the effect being achieved by the use of the TV screen earlier in this comic as a way to remove the violence from the actual narrative you're seeing. They're playing with the fundamentals of an engaged audience, and using the structure of the comic as a way to compel you into reading, beyond just creating a story to suck you in. I'd argue that what moves these pages is not necessarily the fight between Batman and Reverse Flash, but it's actually the ticking clock. It's the combination of time running out, which is very apparent in every physical comic as you read it, because you can see how many pages you've got left, but broken down on the page in front of you, and the actual fight itself and the dread the characters feel. And you'll see 9-panel grids being used often as a way to condense story into a small amount of pages, but King is pretty consistent with his use of the grid as a way to accelerate themes that he's imbuing into the stories. And the artists he works with often step up to the plate and hit it out the park. Here, Fabok does exactly that, and together this creative team delivers something incredibly interesting formally in a monthly superhero book. Thanks for watching. Strip Panel Naked continues to exist thanks to the amazing support of people on Patreon, where for their pledge they get access to exclusive new articles and content every single week. Please check it out and consider supporting. For more comics talk, you can find me on Twitter at HassanOE, and finally hit subscribe and that little notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and we'll see you next time.